any of these software platforms or systems that we depend on could potentially lead to an event like this. How should businesses be thinking about, is this going to happen again? What should we do if it does? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unraveling IT Expert Tech Talks. I'm your host, Brian Harmison, CEO of Corsica Technologies, and I have with me today Ross Filipek, our Chief Information Security Officer here at Corsica. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, it's no coincidence that we're here with our CISO and going to talk about CrowdStrike. So we had an event that happened here in the last week. It started actually just over a week ago and was pretty impactful around the world. Ross, you want to kind of just give us the quick breakdown of what happened?
Yeah, sure. So in this particular incident, CrowdStrike released a content update for the Falcon EDR/MDR platform. So that is CrowdStrike's endpoint security agent. And they release content updates all the time. This was nothing, particularly
a couple
fancy.
times a day, right?
In fact. So pretty routine stuff. Unfortunately, in this case, the content update included a faulty driver, which unfortunately, as soon as it was deployed to really any Windows endpoint that was running CrowdStrike, basically blue screened the device and threw it into a reboot loop. And of course, that essentially ruined availability for everybody's machine.
Yeah, and so it impacted those primarily that had their machines on over last Thursday night and required physical intervention on the machine, which is what makes this even more impactful. It wasn't something we could deploy live a fix for until this week, and even that is not 100% reliable.
Yeah, that's true. So, unfortunately, the reality is, if the machine's not online, your IT department really doesn't have a way to get to that remotely to be able to fix it. So, yeah, highly impactful, even though the fix itself was, pretty straightforward.
Right. It was boot in safe mode, get a command prompt, delete a file, reboot. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the mechanics behind this. So I think a lot of us have run into Windows issues where the machine's able to repair itself. In this particular case, all the machines went through a kind of a repair cycle, but were not able to. And that's because of where this CrowdStrike Falcon driver, and I noticed you called it a driver, lives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so CrowdStrike Falcon, really all modern endpoint security software runs in what's called kernel mode on machines, and that gives the software itself very high privileges to be able to protect even the core of that machine operating system wise. So unfortunately we've seen many times in the past, the more privileges something has, the more potential for there to be undesirable effects. So that's why not to sidetrack, but we talk about the principle of least privilege so often in cybersecurity. So usually that is geared toward restricting user account privileges. You don't want to give an account more privileges than it really needs to get his or her work done. So this is sort of an example of that taken to an extreme where if you've got your end users running around with domain admin rights, for instance, very high privileges, the potential for them to cause something that you don't want is increased.
Right, but in the case of endpoint protection, EDR specifically, it really needs to live there.
That's
you
the
said.
catch. Yeah, that's in order for that software to do what it needs to be able to do as effectively as it can, it really needs to be able to get as deep inside that operating system as it can. So hence kernel mode.
Right. So it's loaded as a driver. Yep. Typically, drivers go through a certification process that makes sure that they don't blue screen the system, which the CrowdStrike driver, Falcon driver, has gone through. Yes. But what makes it unique is because it's not hardware, it loads software dynamically as needed, which is those updates, right, that you were talking about. Yeah. So really, we could be vulnerable to any endpoint protection software
Or even,
operates under similar principles.
Yeah, I mean, even any operating system update.
Absolutely.
This doesn't necessarily have to be, something that's related to endpoint protection specifically. I mean, really, any, Windows hotfix could potentially do the same thing.
Right, and we've certainly seen that in the past. One of the things that comes up a lot is patch delays. So the way we get past the issue that you brought up, which is Microsoft releases an update, it blue screens a machine. For us as a company that patches thousands of systems, we typically introduce a delay where we let the rest of the world and our test team figure out, is this going to cause a problem or not? I've heard people say things like, well, why wasn't this delayed? Why didn't providers like ourselves delay that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in the case of endpoint protection software, you, as a general rule, are going to have many more problems by intentionally delaying content updates than you will by allowing this to be applied immediately. Because if you think about what the purpose of endpoint protection content updates are, they're generally to address new vulnerabilities that are being exploited, be able to detect new types of attacks that could be targeting those machines where we're protected. So, whereas operating system hotfixes, a lot of times those do address vulnerabilities, but a lot of times it's, patching, buggy code, things like that. So we think it's very important to maintain, as soon as those content updates are available for endpoint protection specifically, to get those installed.
Yeah, that makes sense. And often we're counting on the endpoint protection helping give us a time window on a lot of those other patches, because it has that more timely information and ability to protect both the kernel and the rest of the machine.
And I mean, that's not just Corsica saying that either. I mean, if you look at any reputable cybersecurity framework, these things invariably include elements about making sure that endpoint protection software updates automatically in a timely fashion. So in the spirit of that, it's really critical to allow the updates to proceed.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as we think about this event, it gets me thinking, well, what could happen next? And I think it's opened a lot of eyes that any of these software platforms or systems that we depend on could potentially lead to an event like this. And fortunately, even though CrowdStrike's in the news for some data leaks, those are kind of old news compared to this event. We don't think there's been any actual cybersecurity breach. It's just a coding error that had a really big impact. How should businesses be thinking about, is this going to happen again? What should we do if it does?
Well, so I think the safe bet will be that, yes, it will happen again, not necessarily through CrowdStrike, but, sooner or later there's going to be something else. So, this occurrence was CrowdStrike. I mean, the next occurrence could be, another EDR product, and we've seen that in the past. Like we talked about, could be a operating system hotfix. I mean, the fact that we are reliant on computing technology, we can never suppress that vulnerability entirely. So that's always going to be there. But I think this particular situation really underscores the importance of business continuity. So being able to sit down and figure out from a business process, what are the critical functions that we need to be able to provide, and then what are the underlying technologies that support that. So business continuity, disaster recovery, conceptually, I talk to a lot of clients who are kind of behind where they really should be on that. Yeah. So definitely worth the time investment to get those plans developed.
Yeah, I think my experience has been much like a lot of areas of life. People tend to not take action until there's that tragedy or that event. And so I've been using this as an opportunity to encourage businesses, look at this as one of the types of things that could happen that impact your business. Ultimately, those of us in technology, our goal is to protect the revenue generating capabilities of a business, which is what business continuity, disaster recovery is all about. How do we get that business to a point where the recovery is seamless? It's not going to be without pain, because this was a great example. We had just about everyone in the company assisting people and walking them through those manual steps. But knowing how is my business going to run if we come in tomorrow and our systems are down. Car dealers recently experienced a big, long outage due to some ransomware in a SaaS application. So while we're talking about kind of the security piece, that there's a bigger dependency now on more of these cloud-based systems, and when they go down, it's not just your server room that's down anymore. It's probably everybody. So getting those plans in place is really the right thing to do, regardless of what that kind of next event is going to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, thanks, Ross. This has been really helpful. I'm sure we'll talk more about this event and how to plan in the future. It's been one of those opportunities for us to have a chance to educate, folks that maybe aren't as interested in that or don't understand some of the mechanics of how the software that's protecting them works. And that's an area that I find really interesting.
Yeah, me too.
Because it's the core that a lot of our services are built upon. So thanks for joining me today. Appreciate your insight and your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for having me.